Good morning from Ludong University in Yantai, China. My name is Dr. Mark, and I've been living and teaching in China for 9 years now. Originally from Canada, I began my cultural and academic transition to China in 2013 in Nanjing, one of China's four ancient great capitals. Instantly found China to be more unique than any country I'd ever visited, and I've visited more than 40. China is so different, in fact, you have to live here to begin to understand it. That's why the opportunity to be an international student in China is as much a cultural as it is an academic journey. It could be one of the most profound life experiences you'll ever have. Indeed, China struck me as so different, I immediately decided to be fully conscious about every experience and record everything. If I had a question, I'd ask whoever was available, whether it was a student, a fellow professor, or a teacher, and do research. After 9 years of experiences, I've developed a level of insight that's missing completely in the mainstream Western media. This information would be most beneficial for international students to help smooth your transition. The best way to demonstrate just how different China is, I think, is to kick off this dialogue by sharing 3 stories. The first actually took place about 5 months before I arrived in Nanjing, because I first discovered the opportunity to work as a professor at a Chinese university through my former advisor at University of Toronto, which is where I got my PhD in forestry. He alerted me to a couple of opportunities in 2 different cities, and I had some Chinese office mates at the time, and so I would turn to them regularly to try and figure out which place to choose to potentially work. And so I had a friend, Bin, and she really helped me negotiate the system to end up getting a job in China, which I imagine would be a big barrier if you didn't have a Chinese friend helping you out. So first she told me, I think Nanjing would be the better city for you because the other city was much smaller and more isolated. So Nanjing at the time was about 7 million people. It had something like 50 to 60 universities. It was like possibly one of the biggest university places in the world. And so she felt that that's the university I should go to, the one in Nanjing. And so I just accepted her advice, and I started a dialogue with the university, and just over email. And then she advised me even further and said, universities are so different in China, in fact, in Asia, that I think you should go there. You should experience it and see what you're getting yourself into before you sign anything. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of expensive just to take a trip to China to check it out. And she said, well, actually, I recently came across an opportunity, or my husband did, and told me about it. And apparently, there was a business that was organizing trips to China for PhD students. So basically, Chinese students who are completing their PhDs are coming to nearing the end of their PhDs. China was trying to lure them back And so this business, maybe it was connected with the government. I guess it was. I don't know for sure. But it was basically set up to bring Chinese PhD students back to China to hear about the different opportunities in China. And the whole idea was to meet mayors of cities because they were basically the decision makers about developing business in China. So they had all sorts of incentives to offer, maybe for housing, salary, extra salary, if you settled in their city and brought your idea, basically from your PhD, and tried to monetize it, develop it into a business. So China had been doing this for a little while by then. I'm talking in August of 2012. And so they had this routine, and I guess all the universities and the population is in the East. So these would involve doing bus trips, bus tours of Eastern China and visiting different cities and hearing about the incentives that each mayor was offering. And so she told me about this opportunity. She said that actually this was, I guess this discussion took place earlier than August because August was when the actual trip was. And she said, no, you can join this trip. And I said, but I'm not Chinese. And she said, it doesn't matter. Like, basically, China's just looking for highly educated people to help China. And so I thought, okay. And she said, all you need is a PhD or close to completion of a PhD and a business idea. Now, I had the PhD already, but I didn't have a business idea. Mine was about management of forests, and it was hard to figure out how to monetize that. And so and she said, oh, you need to get some idea of a business opportunity. And so that's when I thought of my friend Paul, who's an entrepreneur in Toronto. And I called Paul and I said, hey, can you come up with a business idea that will allow us to go to China that you could possibly develop? And he jumped at the opportunity and he said, sure. And so he came up with a business idea. It wasn't related to my PhD. I was totally going there to see the university. And so to keep everything above board, I told the people organizing the trip that that was the true reason for my visit. And they said, that's fine. You're helping China if you're checking out a job opportunity at a university. And so they knew it from the beginning. So there's nothing, everything was above board. And so me and my friend Paul, we got a subsidized trip, flights, and then we flew to Shanghai in August of 2012, and we met people at the airport organizing the trip, the leader of the trip, and we met all the other PhD students. And there was literally 100 of them, 2 busloads of us. So 98 of them were from China, or else they were Chinese American, considering moving back to China. And so only 2 of us, myself and my friend Paul, were like non-Chinese, and only 2 of us were Canadian. All the rest of them were in the U.S. and could be Chinese American or Chinese that were completing their PhD in the U.S. And so we got on the 2 buses, and that first day we drove to the first city where we were going to meet the mayor. I can't remember. We went to so many different cities. I can't tell you really even how many. It's a bit of a blur, but I can tell you what happened on that first one is what I remember that left the real impression. And so we drove maybe an hour to 2 hours from Shanghai, by bus, to a city called Wuxi, Wuxi. And it's a substantial city in eastern China in Jiangsu province, not far from Shanghai. And so we booked into a Hilton hotel, brand new, beautiful. And that's where we stayed for a couple of nights, I believe it was. And so that same day, we did a little bit of a tour of Wuxi. The Grand Canal in China goes through Wuxi. So I do remember a trip on the Grand Canal. We went on the boat and everything. And that was really cool. And so it was the night after that that we met the mayor of the city and the top officials from the city. And so we had a huge banquet, and this happened in every city. Huge banquet. So we're in a banquet hall, lots of round tables, maybe about 10 people per table, mainly PhD students and a couple people that were from the city, officials. And so, because I was the only PhD, a person with a PhD who was non Chinese, I was always the VIP at every banquet. So, I sat beside the mayor of the city we were visiting, and we were at the head table. So, I was always sitting beside the mayor, and we could eat as much food as we wanted, just endless, delicious food. And the other part of it was the drinking. Some pretty heavy drinking went on. This is beer, red wine, but mainly baijiu, which is kind of the hooch of China, quite strong and fairly foul tasting. And so, anyway, this is where I first got interested or, learned about Chinese drinking culture, which I won't get into right now. That's another story for another day. I have so many. And so this is what it was like, city after city. And what had happened, I'd arranged like basically in the middle of the trip, the buses, we were traveling through Nanjing. We actually weren't visiting the mayor there, but it was agreed that they would drop me off halfway through the 2 week trip. And so all this was free. And so one of the cities, this is the first story, one of the cities we went to, the main reason seemed to be that we were visiting a factory. So we arrived at the hotel, spent a leisurely evening, and we were told that we wouldn't have to go visit the hotel until the next morning at 10 because we were starting to get worn out, like city after city and talking and socializing and drinking and eating. So that was the arrangement. So my buddy and I, Paul, we went to bed maybe around 11, and suddenly the phone rang in the middle of the night, midnight. And I picked it up and I'm thinking, who the heck could this be? And I'm listening on the other end of the line, and it's in this broken English. This guy was telling me that everything had been rescheduled. And I'm going, you're kidding. He's calling at midnight. He's woken us up. And he said, yes. And that's why I'm calling to tell you we are going to be leaving at 7 in the morning, not 10. And so that means you have to get up earlier, something like 5, and, to have your shower and get dressed, come downstairs, have breakfast, and then be on the buses by 7. And I'm going, what? I couldn't believe it. This was just such a dramatic change in the schedule. I just couldn't believe it. I thought this would never happen in Canada or even anywhere in the West. I couldn't imagine it. It was such a last minute change, like phoning, waking me up in the middle of the night to make a change that meant I wasn't going to have a full night's sleep and I was going to suddenly get up at 5 in the morning. I just couldn't believe it. And so when I hung up and then I talked to my roommate, Paul, and I said, what do you think? And he thought the same thing. And so we just decided that we're just going to get up when we get up because we need our sleep, and we'll just go downstairs and have breakfast and then see how everything goes. Like fully expecting everyone else to be there. We just couldn't believe that this was a serious change in the trip. We thought too many people would be resistant to that change. And so, anyway, we got up in the morning, had our showers, went downstairs, went to the restaurant, and we were the only ones there. Everyone else, like, they were gone. And we even asked around the waiter, whatnot, and they said, yeah, they all left at 7 this morning. And they were going to be back later that morning. And so I wasn't worried. I didn't wasn't worried about missing the rest of the trip. I knew they were coming back, and I still thought, this is bizarre. You mean everyone just changed just like that? And I thought there must have been lots of grumbling and resistance. And so I thought I'll just wait for them to come back and then just start asking the people that I'd befriended to that point how the trip was. And so that's what I did. And so I started chatting with them and just said, "Oh, how was the tour?" And they just told me about the tour. I was expecting to hearing someone gripe or complain about what happened, but nobody complained about anything. There was no mention of the last minute change, not a peep. And so this is when the first thing I remember, my the culture shock was so profound. And remember, I visited like 40 plus countries. This was so profound. A shiver went through my body because I suddenly went, "You mean to tell me that this last minute change with 100 people on a trip like this, and this last minute change calling us in the middle of the night to change a schedule is normal in this country of 1.4 billion people?" I just could not believe it. I thought, surely with such a massive country or massive population, you need to be really well, everything needs to be really well planned out. And so I just couldn't believe it. And so this is when I first went, "Mark, you are no longer in the West. You are in a completely different civilization." Like this just shook me to the core. And like it was real. It was a real event. And I was later to discover there's many more times there's last minute changes done, like things that would never happen in the West. So over the years, I've learned that it wasn't that unusual. That was just the first time I experienced it. And so that's the first story. And then moving on to the second story. Basically, on the trip, as I said, after about a week, I got dropped off in Nanjing and I met my future translator assistant. And I went to stayed overnight for several days, I think 3 days, something like that. And basically, I guess the rest of the time that I was booked to be in China. And so I toured the university. I saw apartments where I'd stay and the kind of apartment. I did all that. And then we had started to negotiate the salary, but we hadn't finalized it. And so I was pretty sure before I returned home that I was going to go there. And so the negotiations just continued through email over the next month, I guess, maybe into September. And then we came to an agreement, and the dean wanted me to start in January of 2013. So I just prepared and found myself back in China, in Shanghai in 2013. But this time, my future translator assistant, he had taken the train all the way from Nanjing, high speed train to Shanghai, which is, I think, a 2 hour, 3 hour trip, something like that, and then took the subway across Shanghai, which is a city of 27 million. So that's no small feat. So taking the subway across, I think, was an hour and a half or something to Pudong Airport, where he met me. And so that first struck me as like, wow, thanks for meeting me and not expecting me to just figure out how to get up to Nanjing. And so I really appreciated that. So they just treated me with kid gloves and great respect. I felt that immediately. And so, but that's not the second story. The second story is as I adjusted in Nanjing in the first few weeks, I discovered I was right across the road from this gorgeous lake and park that was outside the city walls of Nanjing. And so there was a park like setting all the way around the lake. And maybe the lake was like, if you walked the perimeter, it was something like 10 kilometers, I believe. And there was also a string of islands in the lake, and they were connected by bridges. So you could walk across all these islands, across the middle of the lake on these islands and go over these bridges. It was beautiful. And I was told that it used to be the hunting grounds of the emperor, because as I mentioned earlier, China or Nanjing was one of is one of the ancient great capitals of China. So it was a capital during multiple dynasties. And so, but this area, from what I'd heard, had been closed to the public for quite a long time, and had only recently, I think, within a year or two of me arriving, opened up to the public, and it was free, and so I could just walk there anytime I wanted, and I'd see, people practicing Tai Chi. There was also a lovers park that had gorgeous flowers. So I'd see lots of couples there who are planning to get married, and they would be getting their pictures taken. And then there's people fishing. I'd see all sorts of these activities that are typical in China. It was beautiful. But what really got me was some of the historical buildings, and one of which was I believe, the Lu Sheng Tower, it was called. And there would be signs by all these historic buildings and sites in both Chinese and English, so I could read it all right. So with this Lusheng Tower, I started reading, well, what happened here? And they said, well, in this place, in Lusheng Tower, this is where scholars would recite poetry to the commander of the army. Now let that sink in. Scholars reciting poetry to the commander of the army. I'm going, what? What the heck would the commander of the army care about poetry? So they were talking about 100 years earlier, and I just went, that is bizarre. Like, the commander of the army even cares about poetry? I was trying to think of a Canadian leader of the military, you know, listening to poetry. I just couldn't imagine. It's a man who's been trained to kill people and maybe organize his troops to go kill. How did poetry have anything to do with this? And so there was two things. First, it was scholars. Is this what scholars did? Just recite poetry? That seemed to be a little strange. But what was really strange was the commander of the army listening to poetry. And again, it was just one of those things. It didn't sort of shake my body, but I just went, my brain kind of exploded. I just was so confused. I just thought, this is bizarre. And once again, I went, I'm in a completely different place. It's like I landed on the moon, but I was in China. And so those are the first two stories. And the last one is less a incident and more kind of a summary, that a conclusion that I came to over time. And I guess after a few months in China, riding on the high speed train, traveling at 320 kilometers an hour, and brand new bullet train, smooth as ever, the best that I've ever been on by far. And then riding the subways in Nanjing, they were building extending the subway system, and like it was expanding so fast. I saw China speed front and center. And so riding those subways, brand new again, and they would have glass wall barriers separating the platform in subway stations from the corridor where the trains would travel. And so it was impossible to jump in front of a train, which, every now and then would happen in my hometown of Toronto. But it was impossible to happen there. I'd never seen this. I've been all over these countries in Europe and so on. I'd never seen subways like this with a glass wall separating. Totally safe and super cheap. That's the other thing. These things are all really inexpensive. And then I'd see these skyscrapers too. At the time, Nanjing had the seventh highest building in the world. And so I'd look at all this evidence of modernity, but then I would have these interactions with the people. And so one I remember is getting my hair cut at a hairdresser. The guy who cut my hair was maybe a young man, in his 20s, and he cut my hair. And now he didn't know any English, but I was meeting my students and they were going to show me some place to eat. I think we were going to a restaurant. And when they came to pick me up, he told them, in Chinese, that he had been honored to cut my hair. And then as we were walking out the door, my students told me that this is what he said. And I go, really? He said, honored? Like, is that the word he used? And I go, yeah. Like, it was totally normal for them. And I'm going, no one's ever said they were honored to cut my hair. Like, what a word to use. I just thought, this is strange. And so this was another evidence. And another thing, I went to a KTV. They're called KTVs here. They're basically karaoke bars. And I had to go to the washroom. Went downstairs to go to the washroom, did my thing. And then after leaving the washroom, there was a couple people there and they're handing out paper towels to me to dry my hands after I washed them. And so, that was, I go, oh, that's a nice touch and all that. But they were also kowtowing to me. There was these things that would happen to me with the people, interacting with them directly and getting a sense of the hierarchy and the culture and so on. I felt like, and it felt like very genteel. People treated me with incredible respect, and it was unbelievable. Like as a foreigner, a real respect. And so it felt very genteel, and I felt like I had been transported back, not just 100 years. It felt like several hundred years to me. And I just kept thinking feudal or medieval, feudal times. And I just thought, well, how does this work? I'm fascinated by different ways of thinking. And I think it's because I'm from Toronto, which is the most multicultural city in the world. So I'm very interested in different ways of thinking, the way people look at the world. So I was thinking, well, how does this brain that produces this incredible infrastructure, more modern than anything I've ever seen in the West, nothing could even touch it. And we're talking 13 years ago here as a reminder. And how does it build? How does a mind like that build these super modern buildings that could easily be a modern New York or something like that, and yet treat people in such a kind of feudal way, a very kind of genteel kind of way? I just thought, like, how does that fit together in the same brain? It was like socially, people were living several hundred years ago, but in terms of materially, they had all the modern conveniences, that we have in the West. And so this juxtaposition of this different ways of thinking just totally blew my mind. I can't say I've really ever made sense of it, but it was, and the next question that came to mind was like, this is so profoundly different. How come I've never heard this before? Coming to China. I knew some people who had visited China, but how come I'd never heard this before? This was really strange. So I started kind of questioning my view of China. I thought, am I making this up or whatnot? And so wondering why I'd never heard a thing about this or heard anything in the Western media about this. I could go on the internet and everything. Never, and I had a subscription to the New York Times. None of this, not even the slightest hint of any of this existed anywhere I could find. And so I did start to question, is this just my imagination going wild? But thankfully, about 2 years ago, a book was published by a professor of architecture who's Chinese. And at the time, he was in Australia, but I understand now he has moved to China and he's in Shanghai. And this book was a bestseller. It was very difficult for me to get the book, just to order it online, because it was during the pandemic that it came out. But I finally got it, and here it is. Just show you. So Confucius's Courtyard: Architecture, Philosophy, and the Good Life in China by Xing yuan. And so reading this book, which I find the best one I've come across yet, that talks about ancient Chinese culture, and but he's applying it to buildings, the way people used to live in courtyards. And so he goes quite deep in his interpretation of how a courtyard reflects Chinese civilization. And so here's a passage from this book that just totally confirms everything that I'd experienced at the beginning when I first moved to Nanjing. Here goes. Peculiar character of Chinese civilization, quite the opposite of the Indo-European world, is that the Chinese have not radically changed their worldview. Hence the ideal of the good life. Ever since their intellectual foundations were entrenched in the Golden Age. Now, the Golden Age of Chinese civilization took place during a period of a minimum of 1,800 years ago and goes as far back as 3,100 years ago. If that doesn't blow your mind, that China and Chinese are still living with that mindset in this day, I don't know what will. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.